Hello, welcome to the Research Cat. In today's video we're going to be looking at critical thinking. Specifically we're going to be looking at critical thinking in academics. Now, I've talked about before that when we're looking at research, there's different types of research. There is public research, there is private research, and then there's just personal research. Or at least this is the way that I was taught it in school. And essentially, your personal research is that which you are doing because you're interested in something. So it's just, I'm curious about something. And then you have your private research, and this has to do with an interest. There's some sort of an interest that makes this research important. It's not necessarily private in the sense of I'm not going to tell anyone. It's private in that it has a private interest attached. So if I'm working for a company and I'm doing research on a particular product line, that research has a point and it has a purpose, and things that are not important to that particular purpose or are not going to be beneficial to the company will often get discarded or downplayed. There are problems with doing it that way and addressing it that way. However, the reason that occurs is simply because it's not research that is being done in an academic, distanced way. Academic research, on the other hand, has all these various controls on it to make sure that it's going to be done in a way that takes into account the negative modifiers to the research along with the positive modifiers. This is the both sides of an argument. Now, not everything has both sides of an argument, but many issues do. I find that the difference in this public research is in nuance. Oftentimes, academic research is a nuanced research, that I am looking up information and I'm looking up a very small slice of information, probably because the topic is pretty complicated. Take, for instance, gaming and education. That there's a lot of different types of games. I could be doing simulation, I could be doing role-playing, I could be doing first-person shooter, I could be doing some sort of a math game or a card game or a strategy game. I cannot talk about, even in a book, I would not be able to talk about every version type of game in every situation. And even if I somehow could and created a whole set of encyclopedias on that, it may not be beneficial to anyone, because while it would have a lot of content, it wouldn't necessarily have a lot of purpose. So when we're looking at research in this public domain, we need to keep into mind that we're going to have some sort of purpose involved. Now, for those of you who are fairly familiar with research papers, the purpose is your thesis. I am writing this paper to explain X, Y, and Z. it is important because, and these are typically then generate your topic sentences. Topic sentence X, topic sentence Y, topic sentence Z. And then I have a conclusion where I've reached this in a narrative. In a persuasive paper, I still have the research, and it's very important, and the mistake that I see that beginners make when they start to put together a purpose in a persuasive paper, right? You're not reporting just facts now. In a factual paper, you're usually looking at a narrative outline. In a persuasive paper, you're now trying to get someone to come around to your type of thinking. And the mistake that I see people make in these persuasive papers is that they just don't take into account the nuanced argument from other points of view. So let's at the moment just say that we're not going to be dealing with private special interests, and we're not going to deal with personal. We're only going to look at this public idea, a nuanced argument, a particular slice of an argument, and probably we're looking at the narrative format. I'm going to study this thing to try to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So I'm just going to, for a moment, not necessarily delete, but remove the persuasive element so that we're looking at, and we'll arrange these a little bit more. We're looking at critical thinking from a public, or let's say a academic argument. And let's go with here. This is an argument that is going to be consumed by the scientific community, by the educational community, by the scientific field, by the historical field, by whatever particular field that you are involved in with academics. And then I'm going to look at a nuanced argument. I'm not going to deal with everything within the realm of my paper. And I'm going to be involved in a narrative style. I'm going to present the issues as objectively as possible. Now, I may not be able to be completely objective because we do have bias. And we've talked about bias on the channel before, where we have, let me change my colors over to this purple again. And we're looking at, well, maybe not that purple. And we're looking at a implicit or explicit bias. Now, a bias is I have a positive or negative strong opinion, or perhaps just opinion, on some particular aspect of this this question or topic that I'm doing. So let's say that if I was a psychologist, and I'm not, but if I was a psychologist and I was going to study 5-year-olds and how they act with bullying, and specifically in the nuance, I want to look at the 5-year-olds in kindergarten playgrounds and what support networks are available to kindergarteners as they deal with the ramifications of bullying. I'm going to present the positives and negatives of different types of social networks. Now, the problem is that if I had a 5-year-old child, there becomes a conflict of interest. Because I cannot help but think, when I look at those 5-year-olds, that I have a 5-year-old, and I want to know, when I look at those children, how does my 5-year-old stack up against them? And as soon as I put that value on, and presumably I believe that my 5-year-old is better behaved than others, I have now lost my distance in research. I suggest to people, when they are looking for papers to do, usually somewhere in the second year of college. It could be the second English course, could be done in the first year, but it's usually the second year of college. Becomes more so when they get in towards their bachelor's or their master's, that they're looking at a topic. Don't choose a topic that you are so invested in that you cannot put some distance between it. And so I have students that will sometimes do a narrative essay. They're going to state that they're going to present both sides. But then they will do it on a political party, which they may be invested in. Or they're going to do it in a about children that they have. You're invested as a parent, or at least you should be invested as a parent within your child. That wrecks the distance, because you will compare that. Think of those of you that are parents or older brothers or sisters or uncles and aunts, and you look at your child and you look at what's going on in the world around you, just locally, and you say, well, my son, daughter, nephew, cousin, sister, brother would never do such a thing. They're better behaved. At that point, you've lost your distance. Perhaps you're in a band and you're going to do something on the music industry. You're going to believe very strongly of that because it is either your hobby or it is perhaps going to be a career or a side career for you. These are not great topics because of this bias. Bias doesn't, in a academic setting, bias is negative. But it does not have to be a negative or positive bias. All it is that you have a particular belief that is going to color the narrative and change it so that you're no longer presenting facts. You're presenting your opinion for it, and that is generally a problem in purpose. There are many problems when your purpose of whatever your research is starts to be affected by this conflict of interest. So, as an example, I did a dissertation on using games measured quantitatively to affect retention. I was curious to know whether the teachers who were choosing the games believed that gaming was either positive or negative on retention efforts of keeping people in college in the first and second year of college. Now, I like playing games, so I had experience with games, but I did not know. I was genuinely curious as to know what other people thought, because I'd never really asked that question. Now, I have a peer who is still actually trying to go through their dissertation. I think it's been about 3 years now. And he's involved in the hotel industry. His dissertation hypothesis is not a question of, I want to know about this topic. Instead, his topic is, everybody should do this in the hotel industry. And it has to do with networking and management. And it's a networking and management question that everyone should do. That's not a question, it's a statement. Now, when I talk to him, sometimes he will say, well, I have a strong opinion on this. Well, that's fine. There's no reason not to have a strong opinion on your topic, except that's going to color the purpose. The purpose of his dissertation, and the reason it hasn't been approved for, I think we're going now possibly on to 8 years in his degree, is that his purpose seems to be to justify his opinion. And that is not academic research. In fact, I don't really consider that research at all of anything, even in your private research. You're doing a private company. I might be asked to do research for a private entity, perhaps the school where I work at, and then I will go to them and say, look, I'll do this research, but I don't know that it's going to come up with the formulated idea that you say. It still is valuable, and perhaps we can learn from the fact that it is not going to match that particular purpose that you believe it is. What oftentimes happens in the private domain, at least in my experience, is that the research gets shelved. It just doesn't get carried through because the purpose is no longer going to match what the person wanted it to be. And it's usually management wants to have some opinion X. They want research to show it. It has to be conducted in a appropriate manner because otherwise it's not actionable. And when we talk about research, there is research that is simply for the benefit of knowledge. And there is research that is actionable. Both are perfectly valid. There's a trap, I think, that sometimes people fall into, that they believe that research that is not actionable is not worthwhile. That's not necessarily true. It may be that it's beneficial to expand the scope of science. Medical research may fall into this. I may conduct a medical research on, let's go back to our bullying, and I'm going to look at the two types of stress. In this fake study, because I'm not really conducting that study, I'm going to look at distress, and I'm going to look at eustress. Distress is negative stress, eustress is positive stress. And I want to look at the support systems for these 5-year-olds that the bullying occurred. It was a negative event in their lives. They went to the support network, and did their support network of whatever it is, family, teachers, friends, whatever, did it generate in the children distress? That is, that they were uncomfortable talking about it, that they were not able to articulate Perhaps that they were hurried along, because one of the things that sometimes happens is that adults and children perceive time in a different way. The attention span is considerably different for adults and children, and that's not always a positive thing when you're dealing with younger kids. So at the end of the support session, were they helped? Or were they in distress? Or did they come out of that at the end, after they've met with their parents or their teachers or their church counselors or their sports coaches, whatever they met with, did they come out and say, well, the bullying was still a negative experience, but I learned something from it. I feel better than I did before because the next time I can handle it. It was still stressful, but maybe it was positive stress. Maybe it was eustress. Well, there is a beneficial portion of research that may not be actionable. The events occurred in the past. And so I'm just reporting this is what has happened. But it's not necessarily for any particular entity to change or do anything about. On the other hand, perhaps I'm going to set up new rules for support networks as a school counselor. This same research now becomes actionable. I need to know what this result is because I'm going to put in these new answers. So that gives me some sort of a different types of the research. Now, sometimes people have the belief that they are entitled to their opinion. Well, my opinion, it's my opinion. So that's not wrong. I just had an argument with this with a young man. And we were looking at it from an academic perspective. And he had his opinion. And he's entitled to his opinion. Well, yes, but your opinion is wrong. And I don't mean that it's my opinion that your opinion is wrong. I mean that your opinion is factually incorrect. And so to understand this, we have to kind of look at two different arguments. Now, this part of it I'm going to present from The Craft of Research. Personally, which didn't entirely fit on my page, let me fix that. But now personally, I believe that this is a great book for pretty much anyone who is going to do any type of vaguely serious research, or who wants to know about how research is conducted in academic settings, or public research for consumption by the public and the community. But this is not, but this is my opinion. And there are other books out there that are very good for this. I think sometimes what people don't quite understand when they say, well, I have this opinion and I am going to talk about it. When we say an opinion, what we're really saying is a claim. I am making some sort of a claim that I want people to follow. So here's my claim of whatever it is. I have a reason for that claim. and I am speaking about this claim, my opinion, for whatever reason that it's been brought up. And then there is evidence. Now, the problem is that this can start to go awry. This whole little chain that we have going on here. And the reason it goes awry is because that reason may not hold up, or I may go and get my evidence to support a claim, but I'm choosing evidence that is not necessarily a valid evidence. So let's take a look at a relatively silly claim that I had with a young woman who's I had an interesting phone call with. This was non-academic. It was out in the private life. And she made the claim that she will not enter the state of New York because it's all city and concrete and streets. And we were talking about it because I had said I was looking at going to a convention in Ohio. She's in farm country, Ohio. But she's interested. She won't go into the state of New York. It's all concrete and streets. And I'm like, no. You know, I live in New York. No. There's actually farms, and I live next to a state park, and there's actually trees in New York, in the state. No, she's sure there is not. So it came down to a question of evidence. Because I can look out the window and say, I see trees. I see farmland. Why is this your opinion? And the default was, and it's provable, right? You can go on to Google, you can type in New York landscapes and come up with evidence that maybe there are trees in New York, for instance. But there is a problem with this because this person's opinion, they have this entitlement that they're not going to change their opinion. They're going to throw out all the evidence that doesn't match theirs, to the point of ridiculousness. Because another way to prove that, if she wanted to prove that she was correct, she could drive into New York and see trees. But she's not going to do that, and that's not because she believes that that New York is paved over concrete. She's not going to do that because she's going to meet evidence that is going to go against her belief. And this is a problem when we look at academic research, and this is why this person should never write an academic paper or any sort of paper for public consumption that is based on this particular reason that she has, which is that this is what her mother told her. Her mother is now dead. She can't go against her dead mother's words. But it's still false. So the easiest way is, don't make this a public argument. Right? Now, she did not make this a public argument, and I've changed a few details in the story, but she'll probably know who it is still. Just because you have the opinion does not mean you are entitled to the opinion. Now, let's look at this in a slightly more academic sense and a little more, perhaps, potentially serious. Sometimes people will make a bizarre claim to me, and they say, well, I can make that claim because I have a PhD. This is not a reason. it's not a claim. I make my claim is that I what would be a claim that will not get me into trouble? Let's do this. Right now we're in the middle of a pandemic. That the US is doing fantastic in testing. And we're going to cite that, and we're going to cite it based on numbers. So we're going to use some quantitative evidence. Okay. Now, one of the issues that we have to be careful of when we look at statistics is that when we look at statistics, are we looking at percentages, or are we looking at absolute numbers? And one of the things that we sometimes have to be careful on is that people will, in order to sway this, the evidence they give in statistical evidence will be in different numbers. Okay. So there was a claim made that we have the most number of tests. Okay. Well, we can go with that. But then, so we're going to look at tests. Oops. We're going to look at tests. Delete that one out of there, and I think I need to go to my top of my lists here. Let me take out actually numbers. Okay. And I'm going to use this as a different sense. I'm going to use this as absolute. Because the other version is statistical, or percentages. And percentages in medicine and pharmaceuticals is generally expressed as per capita, percentage of the population. So I've conducted X number of tests. That's the most in the world. That's an absolute numerical number. But in order to then make that claim, we have the best virus response and testing. That is it true per capita? That is, have I had the most percentage per population? There's in the US about 325 million people. If I've done 1 or 2 million tests, I think at the time of this recording on April 14th, we're something at about 2.5 million tests. We might have the most absolute numbers of testing, but we certainly don't have per capita because we're looking at a large population. So I would say, well, we need to now we have to expand that claim out. Because if we're talking about absolute numbers, I don't even know if that makes sense. Because that's not the standard for medicine and pharmaceuticals. The standard for pharmaceuticals and medicine when you're looking at testing is per capita. The reason the person gave me that this works when it's not the standard is because this particular professor has a PhD. That's wonderful. That's not a reason. This is your qualifications, that's good of what you've earned, but it's still not part of that argument. Right. He got extremely angry that I pointed this out. Yes, you have a PhD. I get it. But you know what? You're not using it. If you have it's worse, actually, isn't it? You have the qualification to understand what's going on. You're in the medical field. which means you understand perfectly well, probably better than I am, I'm in education. You understand perfectly well that the standard for testing is per capita. We're talking about this in an academic setting. But for reasons that I did not fully understand, rejected the evidence of how we measure in medical, in this particular case. And the reason that we're pushing out is because I have a higher degree. Yes, so you know what's going on and you're choosing to not follow it. That to me is worse, right? You're now using your knowledge of statistics to change the way, the consumption that other people will receive it. This becomes more of a problem when we say, well, let's expand that out. We'll go with absolute numbers, but let's change your claim slightly and say that we're going to use absolute numbers for your testing. We have the most number of tests that were conducted, but what about in deaths? Because we would then have to have lower amount of deaths. And the response was from this person, well, but when you consider the amount of population, we actually have very good death rate for the amount of population. That's per capita, right? You're now saying that I'm going to take absolute numbers on one side of the argument, and I'm going to use on the other side of the argument percentages, because that makes my argument look better. And this happens a lot. This is in many different types of avenues, from economy to political polling, that we look at two different types of statistics, absolute numbers and percentages, and we present the slice of it that is correct. Now, if you're not trained in statistics, and you're one of my students that comes in, and you have not taken the advanced statistical math, you have not taken research courses, then it's my purpose as an educator to explain the foundation of critical thinking. The peeve that I have is with people who absolutely know better, and I call them out on it. It doesn't always make me popular. I decided I can survive that, because if you have a PhD or an EDD, or you have a master's in pharmaceuticals, or you're an MD, as in this case. Well, if you're an MD or you have a PhD in medicine, that means you don't practice medicine, but you design a lot of the tests and you do research for hospitals, and you're employed as a doctor. You're just not a doctor of medicine. You're a doctor of philosophy within the medical field. You absolutely understand. And to the person that is probably watching this, you absolutely understand about statistics. You're not presenting this claim as because you genuinely believe in it. You're using your knowledge to create a way of parsing evidence to support your claim, because the claim cannot stand on its own with a balanced. And then you will say that, well, this is my opinion. Yes, but your opinion is wrong. It is factually incorrect because the evidence is not supportive. We cannot measure in both per capita and absolute as evidence. We have to take one. So this did not end well. It ended with a lot of stomping and shouting. Fortunately, we're doing social distancing right now, so I was in good shape. I don't have to deal with that because, yes, you can still have that opinion. The opinion is wrong, and I do not wish to be part of it. On a side note, when you're 10 years old and you start having a shouting argument, well, that's understandable. You're a kid. But when you're 50, you can expect a little sarcasm from my part, because an argument among doctors is not the same as an argument among children on a playground. And I think it's that people do not understand, and I understand that most people will not understand necessarily, but an argument does not have to be a negative thing. Many times people feel it this way. They feel it because I present my claim, I give my reason, I give my evidence, and the other person is now going to do a rebuttal. By the way, this is the way that science progresses. If you look at, not that, you don't have to look at that, get rid of that. If we look at the way that science goes, let's say, for instance, Einstein presents the theory of relativity. He goes to a scientific conference. He presents a complicated paper that I do not understand. Other scientists in the field do presumably understand it, and then will say, I think that you have to adjust your claim. I'm going to give this reason, and I'm going to look at this new evidence. That's not a negative thing. And so Einstein will say, well, I'm going to produce a new claim at this point. And I'm going to produce a new reason for it. And I'm going to have new evidence to support the reason why I made the initial claim. And other scientists will say, well, did you consider this? And they'll have yet another reason. And this is an argument in the academic classical sense. I make a claim, I say why I made that claim, that's my reason, I present my evidence. The other party is going to do a rebuttal. They're going to present their own claim, their own reason, their own evidence. And it's going to go back and forth. But there becomes a few problems here. Sometimes people are used to getting their own way. They're used to being right. And so they will tell me, and this is the conversation that I had with this particular professor, is that, well, who are you to argue with me? I have a PhD. And I'm like, well, that's wonderful. But that's not a reason. That's not supported. That's not evidence. That's just kind of nonsense, really. This was not something that this professor particularly liked me pointing out. I would say that I'm sorry, but I'm not. Because the evidence doesn't support it. It's just nonsense. It's so that they can be correct. And then when the rebuttal phase occurs, well, they can't present a new claim because, by the way, for the record, they absolutely do understand that in statistics, if you're going to use numbers or percentages, it has to be throughout. I can't be changing it to make the evidence look better in certain lights. And I think this particular person did this because they're used to arguing with first and second year students who are not necessarily trained in statistics, who are maybe a little starry-eyed at the idea that this person has a doctorate and has been published. And so they're used to being able to argue this way. But it doesn't matter who the person is. I could have no degrees to my name and still point out this, and it would still be factually correct that you can't measure in two different ways, and that their particular opinion is an entitlement. Do you understand? They're not making, this is my opinion, but it can't be supported, but I still believe it. That's an entitlement. It does not belong in academic research, which I may have pointed out. And if this person is going and presenting this kind of an argument, which is a skewed argument, and you'll hear this every now and then, it's in statistics, and someday I will do a one in statistics about this, but is that really my K? Yeah, wow, okay. That when you talk about skew in statistics, you're changing the argument. It can be done innocently, but by people who are trained in statistics, it's generally not. For instance, let's look at median and average. In statistics. So let me look at something in the U.S. economy, the average person, and you'll have to check my facts on this because I do not have, right now you're seeing the window that I'm opened in, I do not have Google up there right now. If I was to look at the median income in the United States, I suspect that it's going to be quite a bit higher than the average. Because in the median, I'm going to take all of the numbers, add them up, and I'm going to choose the middle. Actually, it's going to be lower than the average, because the average is going to take all of the numbers, add them up, and divide by that number. So if there is 10 people in a classroom, and they're going to have these numbers, here, I'm going to add them up, and then I'm going to divide by 10. That number is going to be higher than 6, which is the median. And I know it's going to be higher because 50 divided by 10 is 5, and by the time I add the sum of these numbers, I add those into the 5, I'm going to be significantly higher. In fact, if I take the 7 and 8, that's 15, I add it to the 50, that's 65. I divide by 10, I'm at 6.5. That's already higher than the median. And this is what happens when we look at the US economy, because we will have a small percentage of people who have an enormous amount of wealth. So you have to pay attention to economy reports when they're talking about, well, the average American makes 75,000. I doubt that. I doubt that because you're looking at averages. And so you're putting in enormous amounts of wealth and you're saying, well, you know, the average person makes this. Well, no. What's the median? Because that's a more useful number to me when we're looking at economy and household spending. Or we're going to look at brackets, and we're going to have different brackets that will have different percentages. These are the nuanced arguments that I expect to see in public academic discourse. And it's also the grounds for critical thinking. So when we're looking at critical thinking, what we're doing is we're looking at ways to think of a problem with connections and nuance. There are very few large public policy problems that are black and white. I'm in the education field. In the education field, there's very few educational policy issues that are black and white. They're usually a nuanced argument. What happens is we have these conflicts of interest. We have a purpose that is not necessarily looking to be beneficial or actionable. We want this actionable based on an opinion. It drives me absolutely insane when I hear a manager tell me something like, well, I don't really have any evidence, but this is my opinion, and we're going to change our processes to match my opinion, which has no evidence. At this point, you can expect a little bit of pushback. In which case, sometimes the rebuttal is, well, I have this degree in management, and so that's why we can believe this. Well, that's why we may have to follow as an employee your orders, maybe. But that's not a reason. That's just an entitlement. With this professor, you know, I did make the somewhat sarcastic statement that that's what doctors do, is they have arguments. That's kind of what you look at in your literature. Somebody makes a claim, somebody else does a rebuttal, the first person does a claim again. That's what's going to happen. Or they're going to say, well, you know, your claim is very interesting, but did you consider a more nuanced argument where you're looking at one particular version? So in education, for instance, we've talked about over the last couple of videos about VARK. So, well, that was interesting. Not what I wanted. I would like to add. Let's do that again. Oh, perhaps I should use the vertical type tool, not the vertical line tool. So VARK is, or VAX, is your video audio read-write kinesthetic, or your video audio kinesthetic and social. We've talked about this a few times in previous videos. If you're interested, you can go back to those videos. But some people I will run into and they'll say, well, this is part of an old paradigm, which is true. That is true evidence. And they'll say, so therefore, but we're in a new paradigm. The new paradigm completely replaces the old, which is again true. And so therefore, we're going to throw out VARK. I don't believe it anymore. And now we're like, well, let's consider that in a more nuanced fashion. Let's say instead that vark exists, but it doesn't have the same place in the learning process that it had previously. Because in the older paradigm, the idea was that once I got it into my head, I could use it. So the goal was to get people to get all of this into their head. Because once I have this information, in my head, I have a 0 point. Excellent. Well, I'll do this differently, won't I? Where are my... That's my gradient tool. This is always the interesting part of Photoshop, is that, and I move the bar too, to be able to bring it over. So, I have, I don't really want to edit my bar. Well, we'll do it this way. Hang on. Bear with me here a little bit as I bring up the brush point. Maybe that's a little large. Bring the brush. That's a little large. All right, we'll go with it. Oh, and I don't have a. I have an odd brush too. I was doing screen toning earlier. So we look at this idea. That was amazingly hard to draw a circle around vark. When I look at vark, the idea in the old paradigm is once a student gets it into their head, then it's understood. They can use it. And that was actually following a communications model, right? You have your message, and then from your message, you have your potential noise. This noise in a communication psychological text is not necessarily, although it can be, noise that is drowning out the message, but it can be any sort of issues that prevents the message from being heard by the receiver. And then there was this idea that, well, I'm just going to receive that message passively, and I should be able to understand it. But in more recent times, this has been expanded out. Even this communications model now has been expanded out, because now we have context. That perhaps the reason that we don't agree, or that I don't understand your message, is that the context is different. And then on the receiver end, we have to expand that out a little bit. So the receiving, this is actually just the acquiring portion. Then, I feel like I spelled acquiring wrong. I did. So, and then from after I acquire that information, I can't do anything with it until I can at least get it into short-term memory. And even then, I have to be able to process it in some way that is going to make sense to me. And then I'm going to send it back into the message. And I'm going to send back a new message. And that message might be a query. And so that I don't get totally confused, I'm going to send that message in a different color. I like yellow, but yellow doesn't show up well. I'll try this yellow. So now you've sent me a message. There was some sort of noise there. And then I received the message. And you have context to that message that I may or may not be aware of. And then I have to acquire that information through the noise. I have to be able to pass it between my intelligence and my memory. Have an application at that point, which is a new message or query that goes back to you. Did I understand that what you said was? And then you're going to send back either a new message that says, yes, you understood that, or no, you haven't. When you consider all of this, it's kind of amazing that we ever have any meaningful communication. So I'm going to take apart some of this. But that also means that when we're looking at VARK, we did replace an old paradigm model, but it doesn't mean that all the information as part of the old paradigm model has to get thrown out with the new model. So in the interests of not going on forever with this, maybe I should have made it a two-part series. Critical thinking is nuanced, and it has a purpose, and it follows an argument pattern of I make a claim, I have reasons for that claim, there's evidence for that claim, and I have to be open to a rebuttal because not everybody will have access to the same information as me. Maybe they have more access. But also, they will have a different way of understanding that evidence. They'll have a different reason, and they may make a different claim. When we're looking at critical thinking, the reason has to follow the claim. A reason cannot be a degree or a I'm the boss or any of those things. That's not a reason in an argument. That's an entitlement to your opinion. And in academic research, I don't care about this. In academic research, I'll say, nope, don't want to deal with it, no interest. And students will tell me, this professor will tell me, well, I have the right to my opinion. You have the right to your opinion. I do not. You do not have the right to make me listen to your nonsense. If your opinion is not backed up by evidence, it's an entitlement. And it does not belong in academic public discourse. I would highly suggest that anybody who is interested in this and finds this to be useful, or you say, I do not like it at all, to pick up a copy of The Craft of Research. I would imagine that most libraries would have it. I own a copy of, I think it's the second edition that I own. I do have it here. I do. I have the second edition by Booth, Colomb, and Williams. It is simply and well written for people who are in their first and second year of college, although I've used it all through the entire education. And when I write papers now, I still use it. It really helps me formulate the argument so that I don't end up in this territory, because that would just be embarrassing. If you liked this video, you can give me a thumbs up. I would appreciate that, or subscribe. I put out 2 videos a week right now, and in time I will change over to 3 videos. Take care, and I'll see you next week.